The Ki-10 was the final biplane fighter introduced by Japan during the interwar period leading up into World War II. It entered service at the very end of 1935, and it was the result of a decision by the Japanese to focus their fighter doctrine on agility and dogfighting performance rather than on raw top-end speed, as was evidenced by many of their other fighters from the time. The early versions of the plane were pretty similar to contemporary biplane fighters, but it used an inline liquid-cooled engine while most foreign fighters at the time were using air-cooled radial engines. Its design was aerodynamic and fast, and it saw combat over Manchuria when the Second China-Japan War broke out in 1937. In combat, the Ki-10 was able to maintain a positive kill ratio, but it was increasingly clear that biplane fighters were at the end of their evolution, and it was phased out of frontline roles by the end of 1938, after only 2 full years of service. It continued to be used in small numbers as a trainer in a scout plane, but I couldn't find any reports of any air combat after 1938. During its brief time as a fighter, the Ki-10 went through a few different upgrades. The Ki-10-2, that's Roman numeral 2, featured some minor structural reinforcements and more aerodynamic landing gear, along with a redesigned wing. The Ki-10-2 Kai introduced a more powerful engine and new cooling system, but this final model wasn't produced until late 1937, and it didn't enter regular production, as the decision to phase out the Ki-10 from its fighter role had already been made. What we're looking at in Warthunder is the Ki-10-2C. This is a biplane fighter in rank 1 of the Japanese tech tree with a battle rating of 1.0. Now, if you're wondering why you don't see this in your tech tree, it's foldered under the reserve biplanes, but it's not actually a reserve vehicle itself. This is a regular tech tree vehicle. However, the plane was removed from the game for whatever reason many years ago, but it does occasionally come up again during anniversaries and special events sometimes. The plane's only armament is a pair of 7.7mm light machine guns with a total of 900 rounds of ammo. These are some of the wimpiest aircraft guns in the entire game, and the combined burst mass is only 0.31 kilograms per second. Plus, they're horribly inaccurate. So even when you've got a correct firing angle, your shots are going to fly all over the place. Now, the ammo belt selection does give you a few choices, but my personal preference is the universal belt for both ground and air targets. It's got tracers, so you can see what you're shooting, which is actually really important with pop guns like this, as well as the standard AP and IAI explosive rounds. No matter what belt you take, though, the overall firepower of these guns, well, it's kind of like swinging a Nerf bat. The flight performance of the Ki-10-2C is quite good for a biplane at BR 1.0. The rate of climb is decent, and you can actually maintain a pretty high angle of ascent with this plane. You can also use WEP a bit more than you might expect, as it takes a while for the engine to overheat on most maps, and its maximum speed is going to be just around 400 kilometers an hour up at altitude. But in a practical sense, it's going to accelerate out to about 250 pretty quick, then start to level off into the low to mid 300s. Now, being a biplane, the Ki-10-2C has absolutely amazing UFO maneuverability. Its energy retention is stronger than a lot of other biplanes, and both its turn and roll rate are just outstanding. The only note is that while the rudder is still very responsive, it's kinda speed dependent. You're going to get the best rudder handling right at around 230 kilometers an hour. If you get too far away from that, the rudder's going to lag really bad. Now, the controls will still compress in a dive, and the plane is going to start falling apart a little over 550 kilometers an hour, so you want to be careful if you're zooming in to attack someone from higher altitude. No flaps, air brakes, or manual engine control with the Ki-10. It's also worth stating the obvious, that regardless of game mode, this thing just isn't very survivable. It takes very little to shoot the Ki-10 down, and even a glancing hit is often going to be enough to take out the cooling system or cripple the engine. Flying this thing out in air battles is quite similar to other Rank 1 biplane fighters, but just keep the incredibly low firepower in mind. Going out for air combat is pretty typical, but the low top speed means that you're going to be fighting short engagements and then flying in a straight line for like 2 to 4 minutes to get in range of the next target. The incredibly low firepower of the guns means that unless you can get point-blank pilot snipes, you're usually going to need quite a bit of time on target even to take down other light fighters. I have to admit though that one-on-one biplane duels are probably one of the funnest things in all of Warthunder, so take the opportunity if you get the chance to set it up. Attacking ground targets is, again, limited by the firepower. You can take out AI artillery or AAA, and basically nothing else. Flying out as close air support over a ground battle is surprising. I'm gonna blow your mind here and say that I actually had a much better time doing air combat over ground battles than I did in air battles. The main factor is just that the maps are smaller, so it's not as tedious to approach your target, and the action ends up being a lot faster paced, with a lot less downtime in between combat engagements. Again though, the low firepower means that you're generally not going to be taking out player ground targets. You can scout tag stuff for your team, and the Ki-10 actually makes itself pretty useful as a genuine air recon plane, just by flying around and plinking a couple of hits on random ground targets as you see them. But just remember, you're not really going to be getting any ground kills out of it, so just focus on air combat, or tagging some ground targets to scout for your team. Visually, it's a biplane, and not a very good looking one. It's worth noting that the front radiator placement on the 3D model is actually incorrect for this specific model of Ki-10, and pictures of this plane's prototype show the radiator mounted further back under the center line, not up in the chin. I don't really care much for the only skin it gets either, so not very high marks for the visuals on this one. Landing is the same as similar biplane fighters. No flaps or anything, and fixed gear, so you just cut the throttle and set down. The brakes aren't very good, so expect a longer landing run than might seem obvious for a light biplane. Inside the cockpit, the visibility is excellent in most directions, but it's a really old cockpit model from the earlier days of Warthunder, and the interior details are pretty weak. You get a scope view that I personally didn't find useful at all, and it's a pretty average biplane cockpit. To close out on the Ki-10-2C. This plane has insane UFO maneuverability, and it's one of the faster Rank 1 biplanes. However, it takes almost nothing to shoot it down. The firepower is laughable, and it's slower than almost any monoplane fighter. The final verdict on the Ki-10-2C is that this plane is surprisingly fun to fly despite its limitations. It's a good, healthy challenge. If you see it come up again during some event or anniversary, it might be worth picking it up, as it'll probably be incredibly cheap or easy to get. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this review, check out this other one.